My talk today takes the form of that most modest of philological contributions, a preliminary report on an unpublished text. In this case, a commentary called the Kavyadarsha Tatparya Nirupana, written by one Keshava Bhattaraka, who I will, for the most part, just call Keshava. We're on first-name basis by now. As a preliminary disclaimer, I want to emphasize that I don't think that this text is an unjustly ignored masterpiece that will irrevocably and radically change the way we think about Dandin. Keshava was a learned and industrious man, but not some missing genius of the field. Nevertheless, while working on this manuscript over the last couple of months, I've had a growing sense that this work of medieval scholarship supplies the occasion to think about historical contextualization and about the work of intellectual reconstruction, work that actually raises hopefully some bigger and more interesting questions about how we do intellectual history within Indology, while also hopefully telling us maybe a couple of things about the subsequent life of the Kavyadarsha. Now, I'm approaching this kind of as a historicist, and I think it's important as an important precept of historicism that the historian herself, or in my case himself, speaks from a position that's every bit as perspectival and situated as that of any other historical agent. So I want to begin very briefly with an aside about sketching in my own interpretive inclinations about the Kavyadarsha and its author before I turn to Keshava. This has kind of come out in things I've said to people over the last couple days, but I think that Dandin can best be understood maybe as kind of the joker in the deck of classical Alankara Shastra, a highly self-reflexive poetic craftsman whose work can, and indeed was meant to, be read as much for pleasure as it could for argument and enlightenment. What the point of much of the Kavyadarsha was, I think, was to be a demonstration and embodiment of a sort of literary enjoyment. Dandin's own term for this is prityutpadana, or the production of pleasure. The best word for this, for what he sets about doing, I think, in English, is maybe wit. Of the other canonical figures among early Alankara Shastra who does something similar, I think really Rudrata comes closest. But whereas Rudrata is often very obscure, Dandin values clarity. His is the rare wit that can actually explain his jokes without ruining them in the process. Now this makes Dandin, I think, a delight to read. And I'd be curious to know the degree to which we can detect any of this in any of his many adaptations. My very superficial sense of it is that the vernacular or other language adaptations of Dandin kind of play it straight a lot of the time. It may be that the tug, the delight manufactured by Dandin's texts was subliminal rather than a subject of direct reflection. But I'm going to restrict myself anyway to just speaking about Sanskrit. And the very problem, this very thing that makes him so valuable and so interesting, I think actually ends up creating problems for the commentator. He does not always simply permit a simple unpacking or explanation. This is this openness we've been talking about again and again in both the Lakshana and Lakshya. Or to do so, rather, runs the risk of undermining what he's on about in the first place. Now most people, most of whom are in this room, have an opinion about this, would probably agree with me that Ratnasri Gyana is the most brilliant of Dandin's published commentators. And while he does an exemplary job of explanation, I think it's very telling that in many cases, particularly in the second Paricheda, what he chooses to do is to answer Dandin as a literary craftsman himself. Sometimes the appropriate response to a poem is another poem. Keshava doesn't have any sort of ambitions like that in his Tatparya Nirupana, or as I'll call it, characterizing the underlying intent of the mirror of literature. His approach in certain ways is actually more akin to the commentator on Kavya, and here I'm deriving what I have to say from a study that Larry did of the commentator Malinatha, who's oftentimes interested in building up a kind of shastric scaffolding around a work of literature, and I think Keshava does something similar with Dandin. Now my remarks about the Nirupana are based on the testimony of, as far as I know, the sole extant manuscript of the text, which is kept in Trivandrum. It's manuscript T27 or descriptive catalog number 1176. Now, as you can see, this is not a particularly cool manuscript, nor was my access to it the result of any kind of heroic act of philological labor. It's a modern copy, carefully written in Nagari with both the Mula and the commentary, with occasional marginalia. There isn't any here by later users. It's really, as you can see from this slide, it's the reason why I picked this one, it's really a manuscript edition. As we can see at the very bottom of the page, this is just in the first Paricheda, as far as I can tell. There are occasional footnotes referencing at least two sources that are being brought together to produce this, about which sources I have no information. As far as I'm aware, the only person to have taken account of this text in modern scholarship is the redoubtable V. Raghavan, who, in an article on the late medieval Southern anthology, the Sukti Ratnahara of Kalingaraya Surya, refers to the closing chapter colophon of Keshava's text. This is number 1 in the handout, but here it is in the final page, the final fragmentary page of the manuscript. Just the very beginning of it, Maharaja Adhiraja Shri Ramanatha Narendra Vandita Charanara Vinda Mahopadhyaya, that's a misprint, Tarunavachas Pati Tanu Janmana Keshva Bhartarakena Virachite, etc. This tells us 2 things. Keshava was the son of the published Kavyadarsha commentator Tarunavachas Pati, and that both men can be probably roughly can be dated to the reign of Ramanatha. This particular Ramanatha is presumably, Raghavan presumes this, and I'm sure he's right, is the Hoysala king of that name, who ruled from 1254 to 1295. The description here of Tarunavachas Pati as Mahopadhyaya is perhaps suggestive of a teaching position at court, maybe as a royal tutor or preceptor. Now, Ramanatha, though a Hoysala king, ruled for much of his career, almost all of it, from Kannanur, near Sri Rangam in what's now Trichy district in Tamil Nadu. I was actually, when I was thinking about doing this, I was going to zoom over to Google Earth and have us fly from Jerusalem over to the Kaveri Delta. Here's the Kaveri River. Here's the island where Sri Rangam is. About 15 kilometers to the northwest is where Kannanur is. Has anyone been to Kannanur? John Luke, have you ever been there? David? I haven't been there. It's now a very small, dusty town. But it was once the capital of South India. The most significant fact of Ramanatha's reign, the most significant political fact, is that he fought a decades-long series of desultory wars against the Dora Samudra branch of his family, which ended up with his seeming ejection from the Kaveri Delta and towards the end of his reign, and his eventual replacement by his nephew Veerabalala. Now this period, the transition from the 13th to the 14th century in the Tamil country, is very, very understudied. There aren't any standard works of this period more recent than Krishnaswamy Iyengar's South India and Her Muhammadan Invaders, which you'll note was published in 1921. This, incidentally, despite its terrible title, is a very, very useful work. I have a lot of admiration for it. Even the basic facts of political history still remain to be worked out, or one has to do a lot of synthesis from dissertations published from Annamalai University or contributions to the Quarterly Journal of the Mythic Society, things that you need a serious research library to even access. Lacking any coherent imperial center at this time, and falling between the twin stools of the Chora period on the one hand and the period of Vijayanagar hegemony in the south on the other, these decades are effectively unstructured terrain. It's thus very difficult to frame larger questions about the political and social history that was the context of production of the works I'm going to discuss in the face of this historiographic vacuum. The only model available to me for thinking about this period of Hoysala history is J. Duncan M. Derritt's eccentric theory, in which Hoysala rule in the Tamil South is darkly referred to as the distressing incubus of a historical aberration. If anyone cares to explain to me what that means, I'll look forward to hearing from you. Now, much of what we can say about this period are owed to the surviving works of another Sanskrit pundit, Vidyachakravartin, who worked in the court of Ramanatha's nephew and overthrower, Veerabalala. Vidyachakravartin was part of a family of poets and scholars about whom we can actually say a very great deal, thanks in part to the man himself who wrote a lot about them, and thanks in modern times very much to the hard work of the late S.S. Janaki. In her edition of Vidyachakravartin's commentary on Rurika's Alankara Sarvasva, Janaki drew attention to his unpublished Mahakavya, the Rukmini Kalyanam, the manuscript of which is now kept in the GOML in Chennai. Now, the first sarga of this interesting work interbraids the poet's own family history with that of the Hoysalas, which roughly diagrammatically we can see here. I've added in Ramanatha over here on the far left-hand side, because he goes unmentioned actually in Vidyachakravartin down here, in his account for obvious reasons of political correctness. He was so he actually worked at the court of who I call Veerabalala III, or who he usually calls Veerabalala, his nephew and overthrower. But Vidyachakravartin's family had a history with the former lord of Kannanur, Ramanatha, the poet's grandfather, also called Vidyachakravartin, So it was great-great-grandpa, as you can see up here. And also a poet, actually a very interesting Sanskrit poet who wrote the work called the Gadya Karnamrita. This Vidya Chakravartin, we might call Sakala Vidya Chakravartin, made a donation at Sri Rangam of ritual accoutrement that he dated in Ramanatha's regnal years. So the family had a kind of ongoing relationship with the court over and across this political revolution. Now, what we can see in this then, and I haven't added in Tarunavachaspati and Keshava Bhattaraka, but they of course are kind of hanging out on the side here, is that there are at least two, let's call them family firms of Brahmin literati active in the Hoysala orbit at this time. One of these, Vidya Chakravartin Incorporated, managed to remain significant in the court after Veerabalala's takeover, while we have nothing to go on about what happened with Tarunavachaspati and Keshava. The reference in Keshava's work to Ramanatha maybe suggests that Keshava wrote his commentary while the king was still in power, that is to say before 1295, but maybe not. I mean, I can imagine a world in which I wanted to take credit for the fact that, say, my father worked in the Nixon administration at some point. I may or may not choose to do so. Strictly as a working hypothesis, I would suggest that Keshava was Chakravartin's senior contemporary, and that the former's work was in circulation prior to the latter's two Alankara texts, which I'll have something to say about at the very end of the talk today. Now, it's worthwhile to think, though, about the anomaly presented to us by Tarunavachaspati and Keshava, that they both wrote commentaries on the same text in succeeding generations. Now, Tarunavachaspati's work, for those of you who've looked at it, is really, I think, the slightest of the published commentaries on Dandin. And I suspected at first that Keshava's might have been kind of an expansion of his father's text, a kind of second edition. This doesn't, however, appear to be the case. There's a lot of details about that I can go into if you'd like to. But though there's certainly moments where he's extending what his father had to say, he tends to be expansive, where Vachaspati tends to be taciturn. So what's this text about? What's the point of reading it, especially when there are so many other guides to the Kavyadarsha's meaning? What, in effect, if I allow myself a literary gesture, does Keshava see when he gazes into Dandin's mirror? I'm cheating here. This is a Hoysala era image, but it's from Belur in Karnataka. Now, the first page of the Trivandrum manuscript is fragmentary, and so it's hard to actually get any sense of it, any programmatic thing he has to say there. But the closest I can find to a characterization of the underlying project of the text, the Tatparya of the Tatparya Nirupana, can be found instead in the opening of the second Paricheda. This is the passage number 2 in the handout. When glossing the first verse of that chapter, 2:1, he writes, I'll just read the English, even though it's impossible to define each and every figure, given their infinite number, as they have been variously employed by individual poets, nevertheless, the early teachers have described the general theory that is the basis for their different varieties, even those that have been concocted by moderns. A doubt arises in this case. Should we concern ourselves with conveying further discriminations of this theory through improved definitions and examples? He refutes this, Dandin, that is to say, refutes this, with the half verse that reads, these are multiplied even today, who can speak of them in their entirety? Now, what I've emphasized here, Keshava's reference to the Adanintanas, or most moderns, does depart from something that Dandin himself says, but I think that the emphasis is entirely his. He does a kind of bit of double voicing here, taking Dandin's own argument and using it to mount a defense of the fact that Dandin's text and the tradition it represents are in fact perfectly capable of providing us theoretical guidance for the composition and criticism of Sanskrit poetry. Effectively, then, he dismisses the entire intervening history of the field with the potential objection that the second half of the verse he takes to be addressing. There is, he claims, no point in further subdivision of the paradigmatic figures that Dandin has given us. And because their model is, to return to our own terms that we've been using, generative enough to accommodate subsequent innovation. All that one needs is a proper understanding of the paradigm. Now, what he does then, he makes good this throughout the text, so basically building up Dandin as the central point of reference in an enclosed universe of Shastric reference. In this, the most significant theoretical adjunct to the Kavyadarsha, interestingly enough in light of our recent discussion, is Vamana, especially his auto-commentary on his own Kavyalankara Sutra. This is handout in passage number 3 in the handout. This is an interesting example of this, a somewhat oddball example, is Dandin's digression on obscenity, or the Gramya or asabhya words that sometimes occur in poetry in verse 168. This discussion, interestingly, relies on but doesn't directly cite Vamana's 2:118, and then goes on to quote a verse that Vamana himself provides in his own commentary. So Keshava explains the occasion for this is explaining the relatively rare word samvita that occurs in Vamana's text, although he doesn't actually quote Vamana's sutra. Effectively, he suddenly finds himself writing a commentary on Vamana while in the midst of his discussion on Dandin. Something similar happens a few verses later when he's defining the quality of ojas, or compositional power, where he directly borrows from Vamana's typology of literary prose, importing the category of utkalika praya prose into Dandin's treatment without any direct warrant in the Kavyadarsha at all. Interestingly, in this case, he is actually following his father. Now, this porousness between these two texts suggests, I think, that Keshava thinks of Dandin and Vamana as being fundamentally of a piece. And indeed, there might be something to this, as we were just discussing. Vamana's text, written in sutras, can be seen as an extreme formalization of a work like Dandin's, and thus is an especially useful auxiliary to it. Now, there's a similar logic at work in the other major poetic authority to which Keshava refers, which are Bhoja's works of literary criticism. I was supposed to come in as the Bhoja guy, so I'm glad to be able to make good on that at least a little bit. As I first was working through Keshava's comments on the first Paricheda, I was taking lots of notes on what I thought were unacknowledged borrowings from the Sringara Prakasha, until I inevitably realized that Raghavan had already identified these in his Bhoja monograph. If anyone knows that work, of course he did, because he read everything. Interestingly, he's actually, I've identified him as one of the secondary hands in the manuscript too, as I'll come back to. So there's a lot of details of this that I'd be happy to discuss because they're quite interesting, particularly in the first Paricheda and about the theory of genre and things like that. But the real climax to this is to Keshava's indebtedness to Bhoja comes in his treatment of the figure Rasavat, which Larry mentioned, where he just simply copies out Bhoja's commentary from the Saraswati Kantabharana and openly acknowledges as much, as I indicate in passage 4 that I'm not going to discuss. Now, the way he refers to, I will discuss it actually insofar as the way he refers to Bhoja there is interesting because it's actually based on the fusion of two different passages from unconnected parts of the Sringara Prakasha. And in fact, he takes up a compliment that Bhoja pays to Dandin himself. Bhoja refers to Dandin as Mahakavyopanishad Acharyo Dandi. And he takes that up and fuses it with a passage from elsewhere in the Sringara Prakasha, showing that he really did have considerable control over that difficult and very large text. And his reliance here on Bhoja is important. First of all, as with Vamana, I think it's fundamentally correct because of the intertextual relationship between Dandin and Bhoja's theoretical works. But it's also interesting that, of course, chronologically speaking, of course, Bhoja is relatively late, but he lumps him in with this core of Dandin, Vamana, Bhamaha, who he also does refer to, and of course, he lumps him in with those big three ancients. And he looks to him, also very importantly, to understand rasa. And this is a point I'll come back to. Now, the other most important Shastric domain on which Keshava draws often is that of grammar. And I think he was probably his central Shastra was Vyakarana. And I'm not going to document this here today. Much of it is just the kind of commentarial labor of providing references to the appropriate Paninian sutras to explain the workings of individual forms in the text of the Kavyadarsha. He gives a painstaking explanation, for instance, at one point, of how Dandin's account of a quotation of a half sutra from Panini, of a half verse that is a quotation of a sutra of Panini, Kalpadeshiya Deshyadi Bhihi, it's in 260, is itself a reworking from Panini, but with a different sense as between Panini and Dandin's reuse of it. He also has a couple extended discussions about the different kinds of compound rules about whether things form upamita samasas or rupaka samasas that are actually quite enlightening. Keshava Bhartarika was then a serious Shastric intellectual, and he's at his best when the Charcha in Dandin rises to an appropriately high level. Now, I want to demonstrate this with the one passage I've picked out for extensive discussion here. These are his comments on, to return to again something that Larry was talking about, Dandin's celebrated explanation of the workings of Utpreksha in 224 through 231, particularly his analysis of the verse Limpativa Tamongani Varshati Vanjanam Nabha from the Mrichakatika. Now this is Dandin at his most shastric, I think, in the whole text, but it's still Dandin. And in order to capture something of the hybrid literary and scholastic flavor of this passage, and in part to spend an afternoon when I could have been doing something else, I decided to render Dandin's account into unrhymed blank verse. I did this partly for fun, but partly I thought it was a way to capture something of the distance between Kesheva's prose writing and Dandin's verse, and Dandin's his selection of verse. I'm not going to read this out, but I'm just going to have it over my shoulder as I turn to talk about what Keshava actually does with this, dividing up his discussion into hopefully manageable chunks. Now, Dandin's argument is basically this. Some unnamed earlier critics have identified the figure in the verse Limpativa Tamongani as an upama, or simile, while he prefers to see it, as I said a moment ago, as an utpreksha, or imaginative fantasy. Now, the first point about Dandin, he's just dismissive. These earlier readers were misled by the presence of the word iva, or like, and they mechanically presumed this is a simile because that's most often its explicit marker. Now, this runs up against an argument immediately from Patanjali, the Apta or the wise man in the second verse here, that finite verbs, as we've already discussed, cannot act as a source of a comparison. Verbs referring to processes, sadhyas, and comparisons only tending between established entities, siddha things. More formally, it's only when there are two established entities, a moon and a face, for instance, that a shared feature for the dharma can be identified, and that we may correspondingly identify there to be upaman upameya bhava, the relationship of source and target on which the simile depends. Here there's no property to foster such a relationship. There's only the noun darkness and the verb limpati, bedaubs. Dandin brings up a few further possible ways that this might be considered a simile. Could, for instance, the verb bedaubs here be both the source of the comparison and the common property? This, Dandin summarily declares, is insane. More complex, but dismissed almost as quickly, is the notion that limpati has another suggested agent with which darkness is implicitly compared. But there's still not a shared feature to make the upamana upameya dyad work. There just doesn't seem to be a target source model in this example, and so there can't be a simile. Instead, we have the attribution of an action to something not normally its agent, which, as we saw in the Havruta on Monday night, is Dandin's preferred definition of an utpreksha. Now, Keshava's comments here are very extensive, and I've given only a small portion on the handout, and even then it's long and pretty complicated. His father, Tarunavachaspati, in his very, very cursory treatment of this same passage, gives a short quote from the Mahabhashya in grossing the wise man's words, the Apta Bhashyatam. But Keshava goes on, and it's a very telling difference, to provide a whole source-critical discussion here, giving Katyayana's Vartika and then Patanjali's comment on it, and rounding it out with an exegetical citation from Bhartrahari's Vakyapadiya, or maybe from his commentary on Patanjali. I haven't traced it. But the real heart of this discussion is the section that I've excerpted here on the 5th and 6th verses, the 4th and 3rd from the bottom here, on the idea of an additional implicit agent of the verb limpati. And I divide this into A and B. He reworks these verses into a formal shastric charcha with an objector, a chodya, and a respondent, an uttara, arguing it out. And he finds here the occasion for working out two apparently contradictory mimamsa interpretive strategies. It is, on the one hand, boilerplate doctrine that a verbal suffix, or pratyaya, is the maximally important element of an utterance, in that that's what allows verbal effectuation, or bhavana, to operate. So, a singular agent, agreeing with limpati, might possibly be able to be posited. The nabha and limpati not having kind of strange ordinary language relationship. But there's a second principle here that he cites, that already existing things, when mentioned, are subordinate to processes. To give the ritualist example, a ladle is just an accessory to the act of offering. This then returns the action of limpati to the central role in our statement, and, as we've already seen, emergent or processual things can't be understood as similar to established entities. The act of bedaubing, never used the word bedaubing so much in my entire life, is predominant here. Any agent that it might entail is just vestigial and cannot serve as the vector for a comparison. Now, Keshava goes over this point a second time. This is passage B. But whereas before he saw this as a hermeneutical question, adjudicating between these two different theories about how sentences might work or verbs might work, here he goes after the deeper conceptual problem, again using recognizably mimamsaka terminology and modes of argument. especially in his reference to the dispreferred need to resort to adhyahara, or the provision of otherwise unsupplied information. So what he effectively does here is transposes Dandin's argument into a more rigorous theoretical idiom, bulking it out, discussing its sources, and raising the larger stakes that he sees it as suggesting. I rather doubt that Dandin had these Mimamsa problems in his mind as he wrote, although I could very well be wrong about that. Keshava's reconstruction, first of all, works by putting Kavyadarsha within a wider network of reference. And this is consistent with his earlier reference in 2.1, to the Purvacharyas who have provided us with a sufficiently capacious theory, is provided we understand them right. I see Keshava's motivation, maybe his self-conception, the way he works here, to be something like that of a practitioner of early music, or maybe like a Civil War reenactor, or someone, or a bow hunter, or something like that. He wants to maintain the coherence of a system centered on the Kavyadarsha, while effectively not admitting anything that comes after. Now, it might be objected that, especially in his appeal to Mimamsa here, he's following the wider trend of the semantic turn in later Alankara Shastra, which Larry and Shelley Pollack and recently Andrew have all documented. I'd suggest that at least here his recourse to Mimamsa is a direct one rather than one that's mediated through poetics. But this raises the interesting question of the cracks in this carefully maintained edifice. His effort to write as if the intervening centuries of revolutionary thinking in Alankara Shastra had never taken place, in fact, does have some important lapses to it. And there are several of these, but I'm only going to discuss one, in part because this allows me to segue to my conclusions. How am I doing? Okay. Now this is Keshava's discussion of Rupaka, or metaphor. Oops. Gave away my big reveal. This is in passage 6. It's here that we can see an explicit attempt to upgrade Dandin to a modern definition of the figure. Dandin's basic lakshana here is on the surface pretty unimpressive. This is the Tirobhuta Bheda. Of course, as is usually the case in the Kavyadarsha, the real merit is his proliferation of examples, but he really leaves very limited raw materials for Keshava to work with. So he first restates his definition in a much more sophisticated way, then offers a new formulation that completely departs from the Kavyadarsha's explicit text, restating the ideas in terms of philosophical semantics. Now his new formulation, especially in its closing nirukti, which I mean is not a big intellectual contribution, but I think is original. It's connecting the name Rupaka to Aropa. Could have come from Vamana, which is a text that he clearly knows, but which he doesn't cite, instead referring to Udbhata and his followers explicitly here. But in this blending together of Vamana and Udbhata, he might be thinking, whether subliminally or not, of the definition in Ruyika Alankara Sarvasva, a work that is in many ways, Larry doesn't agree with me, but what I take to be Udbhata in content, and Vamaniya in form. The very label here used by Keshava, follower of Udbhata, is the term used by certain later readers of the Sarvasva, oftentimes derisively. Now it's important to emphasize again that it's the mechanics of tropology and not rasa theory that Keshava feels the need to reach outside of his otherwise well-established borders. But there are at least two other attractions, I think, in finding a trace of a response to Ruyika's great work here. Ruyika is, first of all, kind of the first, not historian, but first sort of systematic organizer of the history of Alankara Shastra, providing a first draft of a way that we've come to think about this until very recent times. Catalogers of figures not able to account for the problem of implicit meaning, with finally Anandavardhana presenting us with this radical conceptual revolution. The remaining task for Ruyika, as he explicitly says, is to refine the definitions of figures, multiply their subtypes, and discover new figures within works of actually existing poetry, as we were just discussing. And this is precisely what Keshava rejects at the beginning of the second Paricheda. Now, his near contemporary, Vidya Chakravartin, who I previously used as a historical source, was, of course, a major commentator on later Alankara Shastra of this type. In his commentary on Mamarta's Kavya Prakasha, the Sampradaya Prakashini, he, while criticizing another commentator on that text, he explicitly sets out his view of Alankara as a discipline. This is number 7. The real work of literary criticism is directed towards the Kavya Prakasha and the Alankara Sarvasva and nothing else, according to him. These works are precisely the sort of authorities that Keshava thinks are so very unnecessary. So to read Dandin at the turn of the 14th century in Kannanur, it seems, might have been to wade into a heated debate about the syllabus, about what belonged in and what belonged out. The pundits interested in poetry during the Hoysala ascendancy appear to have engaged in an ongoing argument about the nature of Alankara Shastra, in which the classical position of Dandin possessed a renewed or simply continued relevance, but it was one among several. Now, there's a point about method here, about understanding these authors by juxtaposition, but and there's also a bigger question about what we can actually say, to Janet's question earlier, about what we can say about other positions that these two authors allow us to presume or to reconstruct. But having given away my big punchline, I'm going to turn to what I think is a final point having to do with periodization. The Kaveri Delta in the early 1300s was the scene of an argument over the canonicity of poetics in Sanskrit, with Dandin, Vamana, and Bhoja ranged on one side, and Mamarta, Ruyika, and behind them Anandavardhana and Abhinava on the other. Now this, to students of Alankara Shastra, sounds strangely familiar, but also somewhat anachronistic. Here I rely on some Apta Bhashita myself, on the opinion of a leading authority, my good friend Yugal Bronner. Who's wearing the same shirt? No, it's a different shirt. Okay. In the conclusion to his excellent 2002 paper, What is New and What is Navya, which if you haven't read, go read it on the coffee break, Yugal suggests a similar divide animating the thinking of the brilliant 16th century polymath Abhaya Dikshita, also pictured here. I'm not going to have time to read out the quote, but I don't want to oversell this. I'll just read the final sentence here. Thus, although earlier scholars, that is to say Dandin, Pamaha, and their followers, were often invoked as authorities, they were just as frequently sidestepped when new categories were invented or borrowed from later thinkers, Mamarta or Ruyika, or when remarkably new definitions were crafted. This is to say, roughly taking part in this same intellectual dispensation that I see beginning to gel some 7 or 8 generations earlier. Now, I don't want to oversell this. Again, Keshava, and for that matter, Vidyachakravartin, were smart, industrious, hardworking men, while Abhaya was a world historical genius. Nor do I want to deny that there's something very significant that changes in what we call the early modern period. But seen from our perspective here in 14th century Kannanur, Abhaya, in this case at least, can be plausibly understood as the last and greatest thinker of late medieval southern Alankara. Some, again, continuing a debate begun perhaps as many as 8 generations earlier. Now, I don't mean this as fault-finding. I don't mean this, and I don't think this invalidates any of the interpretation that Yugal and others have put forth about later thinkers in the tradition. If anything, I hope it might enrich them. To end on a high note, by describing how the political history of the 13th and 14th century was a historiographically unstructured space. And the same is even more true, abundantly true, of the history of culture and of intellectual life, even for Sanskrit, which is, of course, by far the best studied of the pre-modern South Asian literary languages. So what we tend to learn from these times, and of the passage through them, of works like the Kavya Darsha, actually still remains to be seen, and it's potentially very great indeed. I'll stop there. Thank you. I'm going to put it back on Yugal. I'll put it back on the Dharana Sundari instead.
Thank you. Wonderful, wonderful paper. I'm really fascinated. I would love to see this whole text, actually. You describe the discussion of Limpadev and Tomongani as Dandin at his most shastric. And obviously it's not shastric enough for Keshava. Right. Then it needs to be fleshed out. I wonder if you could talk about what this shastrification, this kind of internal shastrification from within, says about either about the dividing line between Shastra and non-Shastra, and what the less shastric parts of Dandin are more, if they're not shastric, and or about shifting or differential notions of what counts as real Shastra, right, and how that might be relevant to this.
Thank you. It's a huge question and a very interesting one. I mean, it's picking up a conversation that we've, of course, been having on and off for a while now. I actually like to circle back and say something that actually it speaks to one of the answers to your responses to the question in your paper, where we were talking about these citation practices in Kashmir. I mean, I suppose that Dandin, of course, is shastric throughout. I mean, he's writing a shastra, although it's a shastra about priti, as I suggested. But I mean, perhaps it's just that our lenses for thinking about what the early history of the field are so anachronistically determined by what we see as the consolidation of later sort of karika plus prose quotative shastric writing, evidential writing in Alankara. I mean, I was thinking about this because I was thinking as we were talking about that we've never actually sussed out, I mean, maybe Yigal's new book will do this for us, the level of intertextuality with prior literary history, for instance, in Dandin. One of the verses that Pemabun and Janet presented yesterday was, this was in one of the Akshepa verses, was him doing Partarahari, for instance. He was operating with systematic Shastric protocols, but ones that are very different than what we actually have to work with. Now, what I mean then by saying he's writing it as most Shastric is that in part it was, as Keshava took him to be doing, you were able to extract a kind of standard pedagogical format of a sort of debate protocol out of what he was saying, presenting a Apurva Paksha, refuting that, presenting a refined, et cetera, until you arrive at the Siddhanta. So, and this is, I mean, in saying that, I'm just following up what Keshava himself says, because I mean, Keshava, really takes this as, and it's not the sole case, I think, in the text where he detects a real debate going on, but it's the most extensive and the most formalized. I mean, and even those two long passages were about a tenth of his this discussion of this whole section. So, so what else is in there in Dandin? So Dandin he is a sort of literary anthology. He is, of course, writing Lakshana. He's trying to actually give us a framework for thinking about. What he isn't, though, is he doesn't, except in this case, which is why I think it's so interesting, he doesn't chase down a lot of the subsidiary intellectual issues that we know from the later history of Shastric thinking is kind of what a Shastri is supposed to do. You're supposed to predict consequences and carry them through. Instead, he opts for, what we've come back to over and over again, I mean, he opts for this kind of open architecture, right? It's open source, Dandin, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Whitney. This is very exciting for questions that I think should concern us all as a group. Which I'll be very brief. So we have a 13th century Hoysala court, far south than what we usually think of when we think of Hoysala, where we have two models of Alankara Shastra within the Sanskritic debate being kind of taken on by two families, at least two families. One is following this Kashmiri model that Larry's been describing in his first talk. One is taking up the older southern Dandin model and doing very interesting things with it, as you demonstrated, things that are taken up later on, as you said, by Apaya, and we'll hear about it from the next talk. Now, but at this moment in time, they cannot not be aware of what's going on in the vernacular. This is after Dandin has been adapted to Kannada many years after. In fact, after the second adaptation that we know of, that Gil was speaking about, if I'm not mistaken chronologically. This is after it's been adapted into Sinhala. This is after it's been introduced at least once into Tamil. Is there any indication of this vernacular vast impact of Dandin in Keshava's commentary? Because it must be related to.
Right. I mean, the short and simple answer is no. And there's very little in which. So we can speak more about Vidya Chakravartin Incorporated, where they're Tamil speakers. They're not Kannadigas. So I mean, and I have no idea about the kind of linguistic affiliation of what the mother tongue of these other authors are. I suspect they're probably Tamilians as well. Now, and I'll defer to others in the room much more knowledgeable than I about what the state of kind of Hoysala court culture was at that time. And I know, actually, in addition to having these crazy ideas about historical aberrations, actually, Derrit, a more interesting suggestion he makes, and those of you who are scholars of Kannada, I'd like to know what you think, that he argues that the Sukti Sudhakara, that's Mallikarjuna's anthology, was created precisely for this Hoysala, this Tamil Hoysala court was there to, because it was about the intersection between literature and niti, and was trying to sort of keep them Kannadiga. Now he has in part because he has weird ethnic essentializations that underlie his whole argument. But so the short and simple answer is no, absolutely not. I mean, even though his father, I mean, so interestingly, Taruna actually has this one-off reference where when talking about Sanghata, where he says it's Dramata Sanghata. So he's thinking about the Tamil anthologies, clearly. So that might count as evidence, circumstantial evidence that he's Tamilian or a Tamil speaker. But other than that, I mean, and it should be said, I still haven't even touched. I haven't even touched the third Paricheda yet. So I don't. I mean, there could be the world's most extensive discussion of how Yadaha is supposed to work in the Yamaka section, for instance. But so far, I haven't found anything.
But we see that the Sanskrit authors, when they are talking about these things, they totally ignore what was happening in Kannada literature. See, there are many authors, even including in the Vijayanagar period, we have Sayana, etc. They should be aware of what was going on in the Kannada field simultaneously, because there were so many works that had come up, and that was the language, Telugu and Kannada, that were being spoken there. But they totally ignore, all the Sanskrit authors totally ignore what was happening in the Desha Bhasha. They never pay any attention to it at all. That is what we observe.
Chagrin, do you have a question?
Thank you, Whitney. It was very interesting. I'm very glad that you brought to light this commentary by Keshava. When I was working on this in the end of the 90s, I just wrote 2 lines about this commentary based on Raghavan. I'm very interested to hear, can you confirm whether Keshava is following his father Taruna Vachaspati in the fourth division of the Kavyadarsha? They have, I considered this at that time provisionally as a characteristic of a later South Indian tradition, dividing the 3rd chapter into 2. So we have the dosha section as a 4th Paricheda.
Right. As I said, I haven't even started looking at the folios yet. So I'll look at it. I'll look it up as soon as I get back to Chicago, and I'll communicate it to you.
I would be surprised if it is not the case, but it will be interesting to know.
I mean, but the relationship between the two of them is odd. So, for instance, I mean, as we've said over and over again, of course, the point of Dandin is the udaharanas. And for instance, so in the 2nd chapter, when he actually gets to the Upama Prapancha, Taruna just says, he just checks out, and he says, like, I'm not going to comment on these. And so he skips over about 40 verses of the examples. So he's a peculiar author. So I mean, and in turn, Keshava both writes a lot and writes a lot that's actually that's again some of where you see the, as I said, the cracks in the edifice before, because that's where some of these ideas about upama, upameya, bhava pratiti starts coming in his later examples of upama, so where he's thinking in this kind of later cognitive poetic mode. So it would be very interesting to know, and I'll be happy to check that.
What I just noticed now in your handout, actually, in the colophon, I read now Tritiya Paricheda.
Yeah, I looked at the last folio because Raghavan drew attention to that. So it's suggesting that he doesn't divide it into 4. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Now, of course, he might. Now, that's on the presumption that the colophon's authorial.
There are 2 points about it. I just want to inform you. One is that these titles, Sakala Vidya Chakravarti and Vidya Chakravarti, there were 2 poets, two writers in Sri Lanka. One wrote Buddhasarana, one of the important prose works, and Sakala Vidya Chakravarti, Parakram Pandita, also wrote some works. So these titles may be having some kind of relationship with the Hoysala courts, because and we are also wondering how these titles came, and now I am little bit sure that this must have come from that side. And the other one is you are showing that erotic plate, and strange enough, the other day I said that we don't have depictions of erotic things in our normal paintings and things like that. But in the similar way, we have kind of Jataka story depicted in a wall uh, with erotic scene, but it belongs to the period of similar period. And I think perhaps, as you said, that this might have been inspired by Dandin. I think might be in our painting, which is in fragments, but you can still see the forms very clearly. So probably that also would have been inspired by this kind of thing. So the court of Hoysala must have had some relations with Sri Lankan traditions also. That's what
I know that Warder mentions that he meant, while discussing in his very brief discussion of these Vidya Chakravartins, he discusses this the fact that the occurrence of the Sinhalese data as well, which I wasn't aware of otherwise. So you're suggesting actually that, are they later figures? They're figures that are post 14th century. These figures who have the title.
We really cannot date them. They are later Polonnaruwa period. Polonnaruwa period is about 12th century, and these poets lived in the 13th and 14th centuries. So one belongs to the Polonnaruwa, but actually we cannot date them correctly. But
right, because one of the kind of dirty secrets, and one of the dirty family secrets, is that this one, whose name is, he's Tribhuvana Kavi Chakravartin in his actual works. He was an inscriptional poet. And he didn't, however, he wasn't a Hoysala courtier. He actually worked for these different, actually kings, very minor kings who fought against the Hoysalas as they entered into Tamil Nadu. And then when great-great-grandson comes to write the family history, he actually tries to fudge the details and make him part of the Hoysala lineage as well, but he wasn't. So that which is to say, I don't think this is necessarily like a buruda that the family's being given by the Hoysalas. There's something, it's a kind of family tradition they've brought into it. Now, whether that has a later life is another question. I mean, of course, it's possible to imagine calling someone a Kavi Chakravartin. I mean, Kamban gets called that. He gets called a Kavi Chakravartigal in Tamil much earlier. Oh. John.
I have two questions. Given the statement which was just made that Sanskrit writers ignore, which I understand to mean voluntarily ignore, what is going on in Desha Bhasha, what is the current opinion regarding Dandin's mother tongue? That's the first question.
Dandin's what, sorry?
Dandin's mother tongue.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And then the second question, based on the beautiful image you had on screen of a lady and a mirror, I would be curious to know how many people in this room are familiar with the meaning of the expression Darpana Anana, mirror-faced, as meaning blind man. It's a meaning which was familiar to Varada de Desigan in Pondicherry, and it's a meaning which is known to Nachina Arkinyar in the 14th century, when he explains the Kalik Togay poem starting by Vayanguru Mandilam Vadamuri Per Petra Mugattavan, which is a description of the father of Duryodhanan. So I'm just curious to know whether some people are familiar with that meaning. I've asked the question to a few people individually, but
the second I can't speak to, and the first actually I'm going to defer and let Thibaut speak to it when he presents, because there's trace evidence in the Kavya Darsha of Tamil lexicon. There's there are Tamil words that get used at certain points. Now, he lived in Kanchipuram. He could have been speaking Apabramsha, or he could have been living most of his life speaking Sanskrit if he living in the Agarhara. But
he must have had a mother tongue.
Sanskrit is a mother tongue, can't you?
Or was Sanskrit his
I
mother
mean,
tongue?
if I were a betting man, I would bet it was Tamil. But there. Sure. Right. 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 Yeah.
and it happened even in the 19th century, 20th century. Some of the writers that were in Mysore, while they were writing in Sanskrit, they were mainly Sanskrit poets. Definitely, they were using Kannada. They were aware of everything that was going on Kannada. But in their writings, they just ignore. They put themselves in a separate compartment as Sanskrit writers, and they refer to what was written in Kashmir or Andhra or Orissa, all these things. But what was going on in Kannada works, in the Kannada world, they just simply ignore. That is what I have observed.
Just a brief addition. Ratna, the Sinhalese, was aware of the Sinhalese tradition, and he was working in all these languages. So I don't know to what extent we can generalize in this way. Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay.
I mean, and there are certainly cases of functionally bilingual Tamil and Sanskrit writers in medieval times, certainly. There.
But does he ever, if you only knew the Ratnashri Tika, does he ever use or refer to Sinhala or Pali words or expressions or poetry ever?
No, because his audience in this case is not a Sinhalese.
Yeah, but that means when he's writing in Sanskrit, he writes as if Desha Bhasha didn't exist. That proves the point. It's an illustration, not a counterexample. When he's writing in Sanskrit, there's a discursive wall. So he can write in other languages and do other things, but when he's writing in Sanskrit, he writes as if Sanskrit were and Pali and Sanskrit and Prakrit and Apramta were all that existed. Huh? Yeah, but that's in
But
the
Prakrit's
that's
part,
in the
it's
box.
part of the system. I mean,
That's right.
although the interesting question is, so I mean, in his in the Sinhalese works that you've identified, does he go up register into Sanskrit or into Pali sometimes?
There's a question in the middle.
Yeah, Gil.
Just a comment to add to this, trying to map out the relationship between the vernacular and the Sanskrit. At the court, it's a related issue of a Shaiva poet, Kannadiga, writing in Kannada from the early 13th century in the Balala court. Balala II, at least as how the tradition remembers him there, Harihara. And he wrote in Kannada. There is a kind of rebellion against the Kannada Shastra tradition that he's doing. So there is also multi-layered literary movement within Kannada itself. He doesn't relate directly to Sanskrit poets. But what's interesting, I think, for this is that he was, or he's remembered, as a Karanika, as an accountant at the court of Balala II. And he's writing about Shiva in this very devotional idiomatic mode, kind of pushed him out of that court. So there is a kind of a labor division, in the actual sense of labor division, perhaps, between those Shastrikas who write in Sanskrit and they're all Brahmins. Harihara is a Brahmin as well, and he's well educated. He can compose in traditional Kannada Sanskritic mode, but he's an accountant. And these guys are perhaps intellectuals in a different way at the court. Just one suggestion to think about how these interactions and labor divisions at the court in terms of poetic production, but the different levels of poetic production, and that might have been working there.
Thank you.
So on that note, we'll take a let's first